Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien, and in this video I'm going to be going over Dr. King's famous A Time to Break the Silence speech that he delivered on April 4th, 1967. Alright, so I have a YouTube of the speech, but I think it's just the audio and still photograph, still image. So for this one I'm going to read the annotation with you guys, and then I'll play the YouTube video that's only the audio and go over the questions as we get to them, and then read the end annotation. All right. So probably the best thing to do is after the annotation of the head note to read along in your packets as we listen to it. So here's the head note. By 1967, King had become an outspoken critic on the U.S. war in Vietnam. King increasingly considered the goals of advancing human rights and making peace internationally, similar to Malcolm's Oxford speech, to be inextricably entwined. As his critique of capitalism and of the U.S. government and its foreign policy grew more strident, his support in the government and his popularity in public opinion plummeted. That should be public opinion. Okay? So again, as he began to become more publicly vocal of capitalism, and as he began to become more publicly vocal of U.S. foreign policy, namely the Vietnam War and other imperialistic tactics, all right, his support from the U.S. government, people like LBJ, President Johnson, and his popularity in the public plummeted. The last few years of his life, like I said previously, were pretty rough for Dr. King, psychologically. President Lyndon Johnson privately raged against King's quote unquote ungrateful criticisms of his war policies. And the FBI had been bugging him and harassing him, which we'll look into later in the year, aiming to destroy his public effectiveness. King's optimism about whites' goodwill and reformation waned. He was deeply discouraged in his final years with the nation's will and direction, and this corresponds to when King moves up north to Chicago. All right, he did not get the reaction he expected. On April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech in New York City on the occasion of his becoming co-chairman of the clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, which was subsequently renamed Clergy and Laity Concerned. And that speech is also called Beyond Vietnam. It was his first major speech on the war in Vietnam, what the Vietnamese aptly call the American War. In these excerpts that we will listen to, King links the escalating U.S. commitment to that war with its abandonment of the commitment to social justice at home. His call for a quote-unquote shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, and for us to, quote, struggle for a new world, has acquired even greater urgency than when he issued it decades ago. To be sure, King was somewhat criticized for coming out against the Vietnam War. Many asked why he would feel the need to go public, considering, they thought, that it would take away from his message of racial equality at home. So again, he was getting it from kind of both sides here, right? He was getting it from Black Power advocates who were growing tired of the slow progress of nonviolent direct action. And after he comes out against the Vietnam War, he's getting it from LBJ, and he's also getting grief from other civil rights activists who argue that he shouldn't be talking about foreign policy. It takes away from his more important message of civil rights. And King responds to that in his essay, by the way, in his speech. So King anticipated their condemnation and responded to his critics in his introduction. Quote, "When I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live." Close quote. King meant that the Vietnam War was part of a larger, very militaristic national malady, the effects of which hurt folks, white and non-white, all over the world. So King basically argued they're linked together. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. And we'll see this in his speech. In this speech, he was trying to quote, save the soul of America. All right, exactly what Malcolm X was talking about at the end of his Oxford Union speech. To him, there was a connection between the decision makers of the U.S. and their tendency to turn a blind eye toward the true suffering of the Vietnamese people and the suffering of Americans back home. All right, so let's begin to play what I believe is just the audio here, and you can read along.
Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and layman concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end, unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy.
All right, so the answer to question one, the question is, what larger national illness does King think the Vietnam War is evidence of? All right, and he says that in the first paragraph. All right, a totally poisoned soul, in which he argues part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. All right, so Vietnam to him is evidence of our tainted soul. Okay, it can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. Now, if you go to the second question, 3 to 4 pieces of evidence that King uses to defend his claim that the U.S. has a dying soul. Well, first he gives examples of other countries in which we have imperialized. All right, if you look in the second paragraph, Guatemala, Peru, Thailand, Cambodia, Mozambique. All right, although South Africa would not be one of them. That would be, though, a white supremacist society at this time. Remember South African apartheid. Okay. So basically, to also help you answer the second question, again, King is arguing that the foreign and domestic policies are connected. All right, that the same desire to control peoples overseas manifests itself domestically. The desire to control people domestically. The desire or the lack of empathy and sympathy with non-white folks abroad is similar to the lack of empathy and sympathy to non-white folks domestically. Third paragraph.
In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said that it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression, which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in Venezuela. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American...
All right, so he gives a couple more examples of American intervention. Venezuela, Guatemala. In Guatemala, we are there to protect our economic investments. So again, he's in the process of tying all this together.
Helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia. why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Increasingly,
That's a very good quote, and sorry if you were watching it on screen and I don't know why he did that. But he was quoting something from John F. Kennedy. All right. In the third paragraph, about 6 lines down, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. All right. Words from John F. Kennedy.
by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken, the role of those.
So what he's basically saying is, internationally, we've tended to be on the wrong side of these freedom struggles. All right, go back to the example that Malcolm X gave in the Oxford Union speech, the example of the Congo. All right, King gives a lot more examples here. All right, all these non-white folks getting their freedom post World War II, and too often we've been on the wrong side of that struggle, according to Dr. King.
Those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
All right, so here's the answer to the next question. How, according to King, can we get on the right side of history, the correct side of the current trend of non-white people worldwide shedding their colonial status? He thinks that we need to, if you look at the end of the bolded third paragraph, the bolded and italicized paragraph. He believes that we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. It's not just about integration. All right. We need to change what we value as important. We must change from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. All right. He's saying in our society, machines and computers and profits and property rights are for some reason considered more important than people. So in King's view, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism cannot be conquered unless we rearrange our values. And to King, they're all what's called relational. They all feed off of each other. Okay? You have to kind of reorganize your values with all three of those ideas, with regard to race, with regard to material wealth, and with regard to militaristic habits. All right, so that's the next question. Let's move on. And again, to King, they're all tied together. Racism and militarism and materialism are not mutually exclusive. They're tied together. Why are white people racist? To protect their material well-being. Why are we using our military abroad? All right. Many would argue, and King is certainly arguing, that too often is to protect the power and the wealth of white nations, or predominantly white nations.
True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. True revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth.
All right, so that's the next question. How does he define true compassion? Because that's what he's talking about here, all right? That we need to become a more compassionate society, more empathetic society. So what is it, the fourth paragraph? 1, 2, 3. Yes, in the fourth paragraph, this is a great line. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to say that an edifice, system, which produces beggars needs restructuring. All right, so he's questioning the system here. All right, rearranging the system to produce little or no beggars. All right, so this is when we talk about Dr. King being more democratically socialist leaning. This is what we're talking about. He's questioning the system that created the beggar in the first place, and that system would be Western capitalism. Okay, so to him, you need to revolutionize the system, significantly reorganize the system, not just throw a coin to a beggar.
With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out, no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of South America and say this is not just. Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just true.
So this is how he's connecting all these ideas together, right? It's all about material dominance when you imperialize other countries, but you cloak it and you justify it in your own minds, white people do, in altruistic ideas, like we're helping them, all right? And what King is arguing is the idea of non-white inferiority is what holds all these things together. So we've got to rethink all of this.
Revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of people's normal, sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
All right, very important line. All right, next question. What additional piece of evidence does King provide? What happened here? What additional piece of evidence does King provide related to our defense spending to argue the U.S. is struggling spiritually? And there we have it, that bold and italicized line. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And that's still the case statistically, financially speaking. We spend more money on the budget. So again, this is also historically accurate. I mean, the Vietnam War is, LBJ early on in his tenure declares a war on poverty, and initially it's successful. That poverty was decreasing. All right, but as he had to spend more, as he felt the need to spend more money and time worrying about Vietnam, as more money and time were going over to Vietnam, less of it was being spent on programs of social uplift in the United States. And King is arguing that is a really bad sign, a really bad sign. All right.
These are revolutionary times all over the globe. Men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. Shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. People who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions. I want to hope today.
And there you have the next question. Does King think the U.S. should support global revolutions, colonies seeking their independence? The answer is yes. Obviously, he thinks we should.
Lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. This powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted and every mountain and hill shall be made low. Yes. Crooked shall be made straight and the rough places plain.
All right, so it's the end of the audio I have here. So the next question, what course of action does King recommend? If you look in the second to last paragraph here, and we have to look at the very end before we move on, but he urges us to recapture the revolutionary spirit and declare our eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. All right, we need to challenge the status quo and the unjust mores or cultural habits that we now have. Okay, so that's the answer to the last question. The last line, which isn't in the audio. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. All right. So let's look at the end head note for the speech. The speech was a major media event. Until this address, King had remained mainly silent about the war. King had hoped to persuade some elements of the U.S. government, the national media, middle-class African-American establishment. That was the purpose of this speech. This hope was dashed. Immediately after the speech, King was blasted by the national political establishment and press for his quote-unquote traitorous remarks. Negative response to his stand against the war deepened King's growing sense of urgency and pessimism by the late 1960s about the nation's ability and will to reform. So he was demoralized by the reaction to this speech among his people who used to be his allies. I mean, there were many who supported it, but there were also many whom had a platform upon which to speak or to write in the media, in the White House. They really pushed back against this. Okay, but what we have here is Dr. King moving past, this kind of end of legal segregation and right to vote, kind of surface fixes, if maybe you can call them that, trying to get at the core of things. All right, so if initially he was trying to persuade the laws to believe in African-American equality, now he was trying to get into people's minds and change people's minds. All right, and there was a much fiercer backlash, especially among Northern whites. And that's what we're going to learn about in subsequent essays. All right, so that is A Revolution of Values.